The downbeat is wide. And it's musician talk time, but I think it applies to whiskey. So, in music, when you're a beginner and you start studying quarter notes and whole notes and half notes, well, there's really nowhere to tear that thing. It feels like it really doesn't take much for you to miss a downbeat. So like when your director or when your band leader is going like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, you feel like that's this really fine, narrow thing that you just have to hit. And it's true, like when you're a beginner musician, hitting that tempo right on the money, it is hard. When I started playing drums at 11, I think, and I started playing gigs with my dad by 12, 13, maybe a little younger, and but it wasn't until I was like 14 or 15 that I got involved in music production with our local church, and our music pastor, Gary Rhodes, who is just a brilliant human, handed me a metronome and said, hey, you're new to this. I want you to go home, and I don't want you to practice riffs or songs. I want you to turn this metronome on. It had an earpiece, and play one beat for 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day. One beat, no fills, no fluff, just pick any speed you want, pick one beat, and play it without changing it nonstop to this click. And when you do that, what you find is that it's really hard. And that very quickly, it's like, you know, when you say a word over and over and then the word starts to sound funny and you think maybe I'm saying it wrong. You play with a click alone by yourself in a room long enough, you get to a point where you feel like you can't even hear it and you can't even tell when you're off of it. You just lose all perspective. It's very disconcerting. So I did that. I practiced, you know, probably 3 or 4 when I should have been practicing more, 3 or 4 days a week. And I just turned that click on and I just play a beat with it over and over and over. And that alone almost made my music career. I was famous for being able to go into a studio, sit down on drums, and play straight to a click almost flawlessly and then walk away. And it's all, I always play right behind it. But the more I played and the better I got at that click, the wider the downbeat and the wider the quarter note got. So when I first started, the quarter note was this like razor thin line that I was aiming for. And by the time I got really comfortable with it, the quarter note was feet wide. It was huge. And I knew that if I pushed in on the front edge of a quarter note, it had one kind of energy. And if I stayed and played back on the back end of a quarter note, it had a different kind of energy. And this is the difference between rock and roll and punk rock and metal and hip hop and soul and blues is one of the many things. Front and back of the beat, right? So if I have a click that's going this like this, right? And I'm playing drums to it. If I push on that same click, I'm on the front edge and you can feel this sort of pushing energy. And it's driving, right? And if I relax a little and at the same tempo, sit on the back side of it, all of a sudden you feel that whole energy just sort of lean back a little bit. And that's the back end of a quarter note beat. It's really subtle, but you could hear it. And it's very powerful. Now, I think whiskey and categories of whiskey are the same. When you first get into single malt, you think of it as one thing. There's single malt, there's bourbon, there's rye. Those are 3 things, and they are very narrow, and here's what they are. And then you start exploring single malt, and you realize that world is wide, and you can be on the front end and it'd be Ardbeg, and be on the back end and it's, you know, a Scottish single or an Irish single malt or an American sherry cask, or you know what I mean? It's all over. And so very, very often you find people, I think, judging whiskeys and spirits on, well, that's not a real single malt. And what they mean is my quarter note is real narrow instead of my quarter note is real wide, and they're defining their purpose. And so because of that, I want to try High West, High Country, American Single Malt. Yet again, another large brand getting into American Single Malt. And I love it so much. And I think it is worth reminding you. When someone releases Jack Daniels, Bulleit, High West, when someone releases an American single malt yesterday, this is not them hopping on the new trend because of the articles that were written last month. Think of how long it took to make the decision to make this product and then age it until it was the right age. That's at least 2, 3, 4, 5 years, which means all of these big brands got on the American single malt train before the American Single Malt Commission was started, before there was press about it, before we were trying to change TTB rules, all of that. So this is not jumping on the bandwagon in the way that you would think it would be, because whiskey's curve is too long for that kind of a thing. It's harder to chase trends. Whoa, that's grain forward. That is, well, I was going to say cut grass, but I'm thinking it's actually more like honeydew melon with a slightly like honeysuckle, like rip off the end of honeysuckle flower. But it's very green in the color in my brain. My brain goes green. Now, they use 3 different malts in this whiskey. There's a base malt that's at 85%, caramel malt, and chocolate malt. I don't know what the base malt is, but I'm not getting the chocolate malt in this very strongly, but it is at 1%, so of course I wouldn't be, huh? This, by the way, was originally released in 2019, so they've been doing American single malt. This is not new. This is just the first time I've reviewed it on the channel. And this is totally in-house. New oak and used oak. I'm trying to find something other than that, like really floral, melon forward, slight grain cut grass note. Oh, the palate is nice. The palate is honey, not quite granola, but honey drizzled melon. I don't mind the palate. It's soft, it's gentle, not a lot of complexity, very approachable, but very pleasant, not faulty. I want a little more weight to my scotch, but this would land very well with like a Glenmorangie or even a Glenlivet. There's a little bit of that citrusy, but it's mostly a little bit more grassy. The nose is not my favorite. The sort of green notes that show up in my head in that nose, I don't like that. It throws me a little, but I like what's around it, and I like the palate of it. Anyway, okay. So, remember as you're trying whiskeys, there's no such thing as bourbon, and this is what it tastes like, and tough. There's bourbon made in Texas. There's bourbon in Kentucky. There's bourbon in the Northeast and in the Northwest. There's bourbon around Indiana that's not MGP. And all of these things are playing in the quarter note of bourbon. And some are pushing the beat, and some are on the way back into the beat, but they're all bourbon. And I think it's important to remember that when you just have a distinct preference inside of bourbon, which I do, or inside of malt, which I do, that it's not because they're missing the mark on the downbeat. It's because they're playing on the front or back end, or they're playing on a different side of the quarter note than you are, and they just land a little outside of your preferences. But you wouldn't judge a punk rock drummer for not being a soul drummer, because that's not how that works. You're not going to get pissed at Taylor Hawkins, R.I.P., because he's not Questlove. Those guys are playing 2 different worlds. And Questlove trying to play Foo Fighters, and Taylor Hawkins, actually, they could probably both do it. They're that talented. But when they land in their home turf, they're both doing different things, and they're both world-class drummers. And I think that that is the same thing when we approach whiskey. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here.